Thank you very much, Trevor, and good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Cherie Scholz, and I lead the team at Petco. It's great to have you online today for our last webinar in our mandatory EPR series of webinars. If you've missed any of the earlier ones, you'll find the links on our website for the recording, so please feel free to go and watch them if you feel you'd like to. Looking at the program for today, I'm going to do a quick introduction and set the context for our discussion on monitoring and evaluation. I will then invite David Drew, who is the Head of Sustainability for the Southeast Africa Business Unit at the Coca-Cola Company and a Director on the Petco Board, to take us through the details on EPR schemes in terms of reporting. What do we need to consider? What are we doing now, and what will change going forward? How should all players in the value chain be kept accountable? How should we set and monitor targets? The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session and a bit of a panel discussion. Remember, throughout the duration of the webinar, you'll be able to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to direct a question specifically to one speaker, please mention this in your question. If we have time at the end, you're also welcome to ask any pressing questions relating to the earlier webinars in the series, where we covered the definition of producers, various models for producer responsibility organizations, fee setting, and compliance. I think most of you know about Petco, but in case there are some of you who don't, the PET recycling company trading as Petco was incorporated in 2004 after concerned members of the PET sector formed a working group representative of the full value chain in early 2000. The intention was to develop a solution for post-consumer PET packaging in South Africa, and this resulted in the country's first industry-driven voluntary extended producer responsibility organization, which was overseen by a board of directors representative of the obliged value chain, with a set of recycling targets and a financial and business plan to achieve these. Since 2005, when the EPR fee was introduced, we have grown PET bottle recycling by 874%, and we have exceeded our annual targets on at least 2 occasions. Monitoring and evaluation at Petco has always played a key role in delivering our key objective, our annual target. Due to the nature of the Petco model, we have good data on how much PET is placed onto the South African market. This is how we raise our EPR fees from our members. On the opposite end, we contract recyclers who have an end-use market in their value chain for a specific tonnage per year, which is allocated to all the available end-use markets, and our partners are independently audited on a quarterly basis. This means that the Petco figures are not estimates, are not based on sample research questionnaires or interviews, but on measured, tracked, and audited records. Auditing procedures are reviewed from time to time and updated as necessary. And in 2016, we developed a Petco theory of change or results framework to guide the team. You will recognize many of the Petco members featured here due to the fact that our EPR fees are collected at that point in the value chain where raw material is purchased. We also recognize those brands who indirectly support Petco financially via their packaging manufacturers and converters in our associate membership program. In total, we currently have 96 Petco members. If you aren't already a Petco member and would like to be one, please contact Cara. That concludes my Petco summary, and now we can move forward into setting the wider context. This year saw the release of the Breaking the Plastic Wave report by multiple partners, including Pew Charitable Trusts, Systemic, the Universities of Oxford and Leeds, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Common Seas. Our own Professor Linda Godfrey of the CSIR, I'm getting tongue twisted today, was on the panel of 17 experts who developed this work in partnership with the organizations I mentioned. She was able to input the African and South African data for a truly global picture. But why am I sharing this? Because it's time for a plastic paradigm shift. Not only is legislation changing to mandatory EPR here at home via the pending Section 18 regulations, but broadly, plastic pollution is getting worse and fast. Solving this growing problem requires growing a plastics economy that is smart, sustainable, and circular. This study has helped to quantify the challenge we are facing and identify 10 critical findings. The business as usual scenario will result in nearly 3 times more plastic leaking into the ocean in 2040. Current commitments are inadequate for the scale of the challenge. Single solution strategies cannot stop plastic pollution. By applying existing upstream and downstream solutions, we can solve 80% of the problem. Innovation is essential to a future with near zero plastic pollution. The solution is economically viable, but a major redirection of capital investment will be required. The solution brings to life a new plastics economy with opportunities and, of course, risks for industry. Solutions should be differentiated by geography and plastic category. System change offers co-benefits for the climate, health, jobs, and working conditions. And finally, an implementation delay of 5 years would result in an additional 80 million metric tons of plastic going into the ocean. So if we are going to monitor and evaluate our progress going forward, accurate and consistent measuring will be essential. This sounds easy, but is in reality challenging and very complicated. So we understand it's a global issue, and we are often asked how we compare to other countries around the world. Well, guess what? There are a myriad of different methodologies and definitions, which makes comparisons fraught with assumptions. However, this is changing, and the EU, which is arguably the leaders in EPR, are looking to a consistent methodology across all member states that enables and facilitates their circular economy action plan, including the introduction of eco-modulated fees. They are developing new rules for the calculations of attaining targets. The likely outcome will be a revision of data reported and a drop in numbers. Estimates range from between 10 and 25%. From a legislative perspective, there's a large amount of activity in Brussels at present on key topics of relevance to EPR schemes. The revision of the Paper and Packaging Waste Directive, including essential requirements, recycled content, single-use plastics and the consideration of additional products, plastic taxes, waste shipment regulation revisions, recycled polymer and food contact standards, and so on. So amended directives lay down general calculation rules for the attainment of the packaging waste recycling targets for 2025 and 2030. It's going to require member states to report to the Commission data on the implementation of the recycling targets for each calendar year in accordance with the format established by the Commission. So provisions regarding the calculation of the attainment of these targets deal with the possibility of taking into account reusable sales packaging and things like wooden packaging which can be repaired for reuse, as well as changes on reporting. So the calculation of the packaging and packaging waste targets clarify that only waste that enters a recycling operation or waste that has achieved end-of-waste status should be used for the calculation of the recycling target. And as a general rule, the measurement of waste should be at the input to the recycling operation. So in order to ensure uniform application of the calculation rules and the comparability of data, the calculation points for the main packaging materials and recycling operations should be specified. That didn't move along. So not only are regulators looking at amending reporting standards, but civil society such as the WWF, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Boston Global Consulting Groups are calling for a UN treaty on plastic pollution. Christine Close, the global leader of markets practice at WWF International, says, "The issue of plastic waste is only decades old, and yet the impact on nature, in particular the ocean, is huge. The absence of an effective systemic response has hindered progress, threatened sustainable economic growth, and has direct consequences on the environment and wildlife. With this study, we are presenting a business case for supporting a new global treaty on plastic pollution, one that sets global, measurable targets that governments, business, and consumers can contribute to achieve." So the objective of such a treaty should be to eliminate plastic leakage into the ocean by a specific date. They believe that critical elements of the treaty should include harmonized regulatory standards and common definitions across markets. Does that sound familiar? It's what we've talked about before. Secondly, clear national targets and action plans that aggregate to deliver on the treaty's overarching objective. Thirdly, common reporting metrics and methodologies across the plastic value chain. And lastly, a coordinated investment approach to support infrastructure development in key markets and innovation. So bringing this to where we find ourselves today on the cusp of mandatory EPR, we need to get it right. This is a classic case of where asking the right questions upfront are critical. How do we measure against this in South Africa? What are the principles we should be looking at? How can we avoid pitfalls? We cannot set targets without first agreeing measurement metrics and criteria. Currently at PETCO, for example, we report against the total South African consumption of PET in a given year. In the new mandatory EPR scenario, with potential multiple PROs, we will report only against what our members place on the market. So who will consolidate data from multiple sources? There we go. I should have clicked through my snazzy presentation. So there are many questions to ask, details to unpack, and strategies to consider. So I'm going to invite David to take over now and to take us through the fine print. David, over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen shortly.
Thank you, Sherry. Hopefully I can get this right. Is my screen up in the right slide? I hope it is.
Yes.
Great. Morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Sherry. Today, I hope to expand a little bit on what Sherry's mentioned, a bit on the kinds of measurements that we're likely to have to focus on, and hopefully demystify some of the technology, the terminology that we hear so frequently. But before we start breaking down the detail, I think it's really important to start with the objective. You know, what are we trying to achieve? What are we looking for? And if we understand it, then we're likely to focus on the right things. So measurement is such a universal challenge. So there are lots of good quotes out there if you look for them, but in this case, I think this one is really appropriate. So if you're going to measure the wrong thing, you're going to get the wrong thing. So it's along the lines of you get what you measure, but essentially we have to make sure that we measure the right things. In terms of EPR, perhaps the most important measurement is determining how much of the material entering the market is recovered after use and does not simply go into landfill or escape into the environment. This, of course, assumes that the material is not designed to go into landfill, or landfill is not the desired outcome, but let's assume that that's not the case. As much as EPR is about managing the impact of the packaging you use, determining how much is recovered for a variety of outcomes is an obvious KPI. So to a large extent, the relative success of an EPR scheme or PRO is often measured by this one key KPI. Government set targets for PROs, and industry results are compared across the world, as Sherry mentioned. But what exactly should we be measuring and talking about here? So the most common term that most of you are going to refer to, and most of you will see, is recycling rate. What's your recycling rate? What's the recycling rate for PET? What's the recycling rate for metal? What's the recycling rate for glass? But it's important to note that recycling is often this catch-all term for all sorts of activities, and is often, in fact, not recycling. As many of you will know, for many years, a large proportion of the developed world have been recycling, in inverted commas. By recycling, what they really meant was collecting waste, separating it into substrates, and then exporting it. Okay? The diagram here shows just how much prior to the Chinese Operation National Sword in 2018, how much the developed world was simply exporting what they had collected. So when we hear recycling rates, we should probably actually be thinking collection rates. In many other countries and regions, they do actually measure recycling rates. In the general context, recycling rate is a waste management term used to indicate how much of municipal solid waste is sent for recycling. As such, it's generally not applied to individual materials, but it's applied to a municipality or a state or a county even, or a city. And because it's often exclusively measured by mass, it means that increasing the recycling rate often focuses on recycling heavy stuff like glass. So this is a perfect example of you get what you measure. So if you're just measuring recycling as a percentage of the municipal solid waste that ends up in a recycling plant, why bother trying to recycle expanded polystyrene if you're being measured collectively in tons? So to address this, I believe we need to ensure that we're measuring materials in logical waste streams and comparing apples with apples. So the starting point for measurement is the denominator. This tells us how much material by type is placed on the market by producers. You may see reference to POM in some references. In the past, this was actually quite difficult to measure accurately because no one really wants to tell you exactly what they're selling. And so PROs and governments and marketing insight companies would try and estimate it. But as you would have gathered from the last webinar, under regulated EPR, members must regularly declare their consumption to their PRO. So now the PRO should know exactly how much material is placed on the market. Of course, they should do some sense checking to ensure their members are being honest, but as each PRO must report on the consumption of their members, something I'll come back to later, they literally get the info they need sent directly to them. But again, it isn't as easy as it may seem. To ensure consistency across the various PROs, we do need some rules about what we will count and what we won't count. So as we're setting out to measure material that reaches the customer, we should exclude material lost in the factory and product that's returned to the factory. As we're setting to measure the collection rate for a defined territory, we should exclude materials that leave that region, but we should include materials imported into the region for sale, even if they're imported as finished goods. Although in some material streams, imports and exports may not be significant, there are others where these two factors can drastically change the result. We must be consistent about how we treat returnable packaging. And returnable packaging is an interesting one. There's two approaches to it. As we're looking to measure what enters the general waste stream, perhaps we should only count the returnable packaging that enters the waste stream. So this means we ignore the recirculating float of returnables. In other words, the material that goes back to the shop and back to the producer. Now, it's very difficult to measure exactly how much returnable packaging is permanently lost. So although businesses like Coca-Cola and South African breweries try to measure this, you're never actually sure whether a bottle is sitting in a garage somewhere or it's actually broken or lost. So the way that it's typically done is that we count returnables by measuring the new returnable packaging in the market. Essentially, we're assuming that new returnable packaging is either replacing old returnables lost during use, or it's growing the float. In this way, we only count the returnables once. You could argue, however, that if returnables are going onto the market and reaching the consumer, and that they're being returned as opposed to being recycled or collected, that the returning process also forms part of your collection. Most importantly, however, you must be clear and you must ensure that if you're doing it one way for glass, you're doing it the same way for plastic or for crates or for other materials. The rules have to be consistent. So, as critically, we must be clear on what we're measuring in the analysis. In this space, broad categories can cause issues. So we'll see things like packaging or paper or plastic. So let's take a term like aluminium packaging, for example. Well, what are we including here? Okay, so beverage cans, absolutely, they must be in. Aerosol cans, well, mostly they're made out of aluminium. They've got some plastic and some steel in them. So maybe we should include them, maybe we shouldn't. What about foil? Is that packaging? Well, the foil on the top of an instant coffee jar is packaging. A pie dish might be considered packaging. But is the roll of foil you use at home when you're cooking a turkey, is that packaging? Well, I don't know, maybe. What about the laminated polyethylene or polypropylene with an aluminum coating? Should that be in metals or should that be in plastics? What about Tetra Paks? They're made of paper, polyethylene, and aluminum. Where do they go? So basically, we need to be specific. We need to call out what we are measuring, and we need to ensure that when we get to collection, our denominator makes sense. In summary, what we're measuring must be aligned in terms of what we include in the denominator and in the numerator. So now, deciding what to count and what not to count is simply a matter of setting rules. But the other key element of waste of segmentation is waste stream alignment. While it might be possible for us to divide markets and products into any number of categories in terms of packaging on the market, it's seldom possible to match this level of granularity when measuring waste. So this is because when you measure waste, you have to align with waste streams identified by the waste industry. You may be able to ask your producers to separate shampoo bottles from conditioner bottles in their declarations, and you could set different EPR fees for them. But good luck asking recyclers to measure these separately. So whilst we can still differentiate EPR fees with more granularity, from a KPI perspective, we have some limits. It's also important for the PROs themselves. And as you will now know, PROs internationally are seldom limited to only one material. But where we do choose to separate, I believe that alignment with waste streams is the only practical approach that makes sense. So for example, in the rigid HDPE space, we typically see differentiation into colors and white or natural. In some countries, waste management will separate milk bottles from other HDPE regardless of colors because they earn a premium for material that comes from food. Essentially, what you can measure will be limited by what and how the waste industry classifies material. It's not impossible to create new categories and increase separation, but there will have to be a financial incentive for this. So while it's probably possible to measure dairy HDPE versus non-dairy, it's not going to be possible to measure shampoo collection versus conditioners collection. So, as I said earlier, the key KPI in EPR terms is collection. Yes, we want to see as much of what we collect recycled as well, but this is actually a secondary measure. For some materials, everything that is collected will be locally recycled, but for others, local recycling is just not possible. This may mean that the material is exported for recycling elsewhere, or it may be processed in some other way. Compostables might be sent for composting, and some materials may need to be burnt in waste-to-energy plants. As a side note, composting is often, but not always, included in recycling when referring to municipal solid waste. So again, the rules need to be clear. So it's important to acknowledge that there can be a difference between collection and recycling. Now, to measure collection, the reflex may be to measure material collected on the left-hand side of this diagram. As such, people often try to measure collection at buyback centers or through waste management companies. In an environment that's dominated by informal collection, measuring collection is extremely difficult. And where there are multiple middlemen between the collection and the recycling, one of the major risks you have is double counting. How do you know that the material that you're collecting at or measuring at this buyback center wasn't already collected in another buyback center along the way? So to avoid this, the best practice suggests that you should measure collection only at the end of the value chain. This means either at the point of export or as an input to a recycler or waste-to-energy plant or composting facility. The other reason for measuring the material at this point is that it would generally have undergone some sorting. And critically, this step normally involves an independent commercial transaction, which then gives it credibility and auditability. The reason for this is simple. One of the biggest challenges in the collection, and by this I mean how much of what you're measuring is actually what you are intending to measure. So people say recycling is a dirty business, and they're right. If you look at these 3 bales of PET, you will see vastly different standards between them. The challenge from a PRO perspective is, how do we measure this? How do we account for the labels and closures, the water, the leftover contents, the dirt? And this doesn't only apply to plastic bottles. The paper industry know very well that about 12% of what they buy as paper generally isn't paper. Recyclers often add a bit of water to the corrugates to increase the mass, and then the labels, the staples, and the sticky tape. This is the primary reason why so-called recycling numbers have been restated in many countries. Another critical element to consider in the collection space is industrial scrap or waste. This, like so much in the space, isn't as easy as it seems initially. The most critical principle here is what the accountants call matching. By this, we mean comparing apples with apples. Remember when we looked at the material on the market? We only counted the material reaching the customer or the consumer. And so when we measure collection, we need to do the same. This means we don't count pre-consumer waste. So to be clear, the plastic bottles that are lost in the factory should absolutely be recycled, but they should not be considered as collected in our collection KPI. Well, why? Well, because we didn't count them in the denominator. And from an EPR perspective, what we are trying to measure is our impact on post-consumer material. This is really important, because it's really tempting to add this pre-consumer material to our tonnage. After all, it is being recycled. But in terms of an accurate collection metric, it should be excluded. So now that we understand a bit about collection, we can turn our attention to recycling. Now, the challenge with the term recycling is that it means different things to different people. For many people, recycling rates refer to the material that goes into the recycler. And in some materials where everything that is collected is recycled, this means that collection and recycling become terms that are almost interchangeable. But when we define these terms for all materials, we need to understand that what works for PET doesn't necessarily apply for glass or metal or paper. So we need to be clear, and we need to have rules. So now, although many see recycling as meaning the input, for others, it means what comes out of the recycling process. And again, for different materials, it has more or less relevance. Some materials lose a lot change. The difference between what comes in and out is significant, and for others it isn't. So recycled output is useful for 2 reasons. First, it gives us a better understanding of what actually comes out of the recycling process. And again, as I said, it varies by material. But for other materials, the difference between what comes in and out is what we refer to as recycling yield. And this is generally a reflection on both the process or technology being used, as well as the quality of the input material. And for this reason, in some materials, the yield and specified to verify the purity of the input material. So as I've highlighted, recycling is not always equal to collection. It can be less than recycling, or when we look at recycling tonnage, it can be more. This is because pre-consumer waste is typically included in the recycling numbers. After all, this material is waste, and where possible, it should be recycled. In some countries, including South Africa, recycled tonnage often also includes imported materials. And in the Far East, there are places where imported tonnage can even exceed locally collected tonnage. So where recyclers are converting materials sourced from multiple countries in these massive big recycling plants that we see in places like Indonesia. So important to differentiate recycling into input and output. So if we know what and how we should measure, the question is, how are we going to report it? Now, Sherry gave a little bit of a heads up to this, but this is probably going to have something that you're going to have some questions about. The biggest change that we have to get our heads around is the impact of multiple PROs. So until now, the South African PROs have largely tried to report on the material they represent, so plastic, PET or polyolefins or metal or glass, in the context of the market as a whole. Under Section 18, it will be possible to have more than one PRO for a material, and each PRO will only have accountability to its paying members. Remember that the PRO takes on the legal obligation of the members that join, declare consumption, and pay their fair share. It is the PRO's responsibility to then report on their behalf. and not on behalf of free riders or non-members or other PROs. This means that each PRO reports collection versus their members' material placed on market, not versus the entire market. And this is really important because each PRO must be evaluated separately. This sounds petty, but it's actually a critical control. Because we're going to allow the formation of multiple PROs, we cannot have a situation where a small PRO that does nothing benefits from the efforts of a more established PRO in terms of the collection KPI. So imagine if the larger PRO will report on the collection they fund and report this as a percentage of their members' footprint. If the small PRO does no collection, then their collection rate and their members' collection rate can be zero. So to be clear, you can have two PET PROs with different recycling numbers, different collection numbers. All of the KPIs can be different. So if we now have multiple PROs with multiple collection rates, how do we pull this all together? Well, best practice suggests that there needs to be a central body that does just that. This is typically called a clearinghouse, and it could be an independent organization, an umbrella body for PROs, or it could be government run. The key is that whoever pulls this information together must be independent from the PROs themselves and be equipped to analyze and consolidate information in a meaningful way. In some countries, the central body also acts as a gatekeeper and an enforcer, checking on producers and ensuring that their data is being captured by the appropriate PROs. In Germany, they actually literally have to go out and find the free riders, as it were. So to facilitate this, in some cases, the producers have to report their consumption directly to the clearinghouse as well as to their PRO. So this gives the clearinghouse the raw data to do the compliance checkings. In other words, the clearinghouse can look at all the materials that the producer is declaring and then make sure that for each one of those materials they belong to a PRO and that they're actually paying. Then they can double check with the PRO to make sure they're paying. The most important job of the clearinghouse is to ensure that the data being reported by the PRO is accurate and consistently measured. So in other words, the rules are being applied by the PRO themselves. So this may mean auditing or checking methodologies from time to time, and also comparing consolidated data versus other market data that they may get. So it wouldn't make sense if the PET PROs report a market size of 200,000 tons, but BMI or Nielsen estimates 300,000 tons. Somebody's wrong. In the South African Section 18 scenario, this idea of a clearinghouse really hasn't been addressed either by industry or government, clearly. But assuming that we will see regulations along the lines of what has been drafted and discussed, it will be necessary. Most importantly, for a PRO like Petco, it will mean that we will report collection versus what is put on the market by our paying members and not try to determine a national PET recycling rate. So when you look at the whole picture, it's important to remember, firstly, you need to accurately measure the market size or the material placed on the market, so the POM. You need to ensure that you're clear about what you're including and excluding from your categories. So when you say metal or you say aluminium, you got to be clear on what you include. When you say PET, you got to be clear whether you're talking about PET beverage bottles, PET beverage and home and personal care, PET beverage, home and personal care, thermoforms, and oil bottles. Very important to clarify those categories. Then, assuming you know how you will be supporting then your collection, you need to accurately measure it in the right place. Oh, sorry. And ensure that what you measure from a collection perspective is aligned to what you're putting in terms of the market. Remember, you've got to be comparing apples with apples. If it's relevant, then you can measure how much of what gets collected gets recycled, but understand that it may not be relevant for every material or in every country. The reality is that across Africa, for example, there are many countries where local recycling just simply can't happen. So everything gets recycled everything gets exported to be recycled somewhere else. So lastly, you can measure how much of what recycled results in recycled material, and therefore determine how much is lost in the process. And if too much is being lost in the process, then you can question, have you allowed for enough dirt or other contaminants in the input material as well? So that is a very quick run through what I see is best practice in the waste management space. It's probably different to what some of you are thinking, but I hope it gives you a better appreciation for why, before we can start to talk about percentages and targets, it's so important that we set out the rules for measurement and that these are clearly defined. And that means that they need to be clearly defined in the regulations, and that what we get as our targets, or what we agree to as targets in the regulations, is aligned to the methodology. And remember, this may mean restating some numbers historically. And as Sherry mentioned, that process we're not alone in that process. So sometimes it's good to make a clean start and start with some new numbers. But now it's over to Cara for some Q&A, and then I think a bit of a wrap up of the process as a whole. Cara?
Thank you very much, David. Very interesting as always. Just a reminder to please submit questions to the Q&A. As Cherie mentioned earlier, we are open to questions not only on this session, but if you have had any other questions which have evolved over time, please feel free to submit them. So I think just to kick off, the question has just come through. What should producers have on their to-do list in order to prepare for this impending legislation? If you could highlight a few starting points. I think it can be a little bit daunting about where to start with all of this.
Do you want me to start with that, Cara?
Yes, David.
I think this is the time of year, and I did mention it in the second webcast, I think, is that this is the time of year where a lot of us are sort of preparing our budgets and looking forward to the year ahead. Obviously, 2020 has been a very difficult year, and 2021 may still be a difficult year. But I think what producers should be doing right now is trying to understand their footprint of all the materials that they use, and starting to look at what they are likely to have to contribute in terms of EPR, assuming that, I mean, obviously for those that are already members of PROs, you have a good idea of what you need to contribute per ton. And for those that are not, you start to look at what are the rates per ton that you're going to have to pay. And in general, what we see is that even where people are members of one or two PROs, they've maybe forgotten about some of the secondary packaging or tertiary packaging even that is part of their footprint. So I think that that's the space where people are suddenly going to have to really look beyond the obvious, So as Coca-Cola, sure, we make PET bottles or aluminum cans or glass bottles, but we've got to make sure that we're looking at the closure, the label, the LDP shrink sleeve, the crate, the cardboard layer board that goes at the bottom of the product, the stretch wrap that goes around the pallet, the strapping even that goes around the pallet. And those are the things that I think businesses should be really focusing on now, and start with the first step, which is, what is my packaging footprint that is going to be affected by this legislation? Step one. Then work out some estimates based on feedback from PROs. What are the likely EPR fees, and how much am I going to have to budget for EPR in 2021? Because it's no longer going to be voluntary, and it's not going to be something that you can say, I'm sorry, I can't contribute this year, I didn't budget for it. And that means that those of us who are, sort of aware, are going to face a lot of internal negative feedback if we've forgotten to tell the business that there's a big EPR business coming in 2020. So I think that's really where people should start, and then start to think about what kind of which PROs they're going to join, are they, and how they want to participate in it. And as we've said in the previous discussions, it's really also going to involve a shift from PROs being very sort of let's call it packaging industry led, to PROs being much more producer led and brand owner led. And I think that's a critical shift. So it might be, who's going to represent you on a PRO? How are you going to get involved in the PRO? How are you going to make sure the PRO is going to spend all that money that you're now going to budget for safely? And the time to do that is right now. It's budget season.
I think, David, I would like to add as well is communicate and share this information with your customers, because there seems to be an inordinate number of businesses out there who seem to be simply not aware of this changing legislation. So please make sure that you tell your customers and your suppliers and get them all up to speed.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, because the reality of EPR and of EPR fees is that ultimately these costs do get passed through to the consumer. So, you know, if people are talking about pricing strategies for 2021, these are things that the commercial teams within the businesses are going to have to take accountability of. And for businesses that are passing on these costs to their customers in a business-to-business environment, it's important to raise these things early so that people are also aware that EPR is coming and it is not going to be free.
And just to add to that, I will also be sending out a consolidated email with the links to all of the recordings, so you can feel free to pass those on to your customers. So there is another question. It says, is there a mature recycling stream for HIPS, HIPS, and EPS? I'm not sure what that stands for. Cherie and David, do you know?
High impact polystyrene and
okay.
Expanded polystyrene.
I've learned something today.
Sure. I mean, obviously the Polystyrene Association are sort of one of the PROs that have been involved, and my suggestion would be that they contact
Audrey Spanenberg.
Yeah, Audrey Spanenberg. So I think Audrey will be able to give more detail, but I think the challenge with polystyrene is that there is some recycling. There are ways that it can be recycled. The challenge is really that it's not national. It's not something that is everywhere yet, and that is certainly sort of something that will have to be, you know, taken on under the EPR legislation. And remember that, again, one of the key things and the challenge with, you know, I mentioned polystyrene earlier being a challenge from a recycling KPI point of view, because it's so light. And, you know, in the US and in many countries where they measure it in tons, you know, polystyrene is just not something you focus on because it's too light. But the challenge with it is that it's very light and it is very low value per kilo at the moment. And that means that it's not necessarily collected by the informal collection, who we know do most of the collection. So I think the answer is it can be recycled with effort, but it's not widely recycled yet. And that's the challenge that those using the material are going to have to address, either through you know, a concerted increase in EPR fees and contributions to try and make it more valuable and make it more widely recycled, or, you know, brand owners are going to have to decide whether they still want to use it. It's a difficult, and it's a problem that I have to deal with as well, because we also sell coffee cups and they currently use high impact polystyrene lids.
Thank you, David. Another question has come through. It says, any update on biodegradable/compostable communities' approach to EPR? Are they exempt?
No,
So, yeah, Cherie, go ahead, yeah.
Yes, in fact, before we started these mandatory EPR webinars, we did one on compostability and biodegradability, which is really informative and well worth the watch. The two areas have been separated, actually. So I know we often combine them when we talk about them, but there is a composting association already formulated, and this sector will be required to also have a producer responsibility organization in order to report back on how much they collect and what happens to it. David, I think you may have something to add as well.
Yeah, I think you know I think that the way to look at it is to say, okay, well, if we put them on, as Cherie said, they're separate, but first thing is, under the regulations that have been drafted, they're included. So in some countries they are excluded. So it you know, it depends on how the regulations are written. But in South Africa, they're considered as a category of packaging, just like metal, just like glass, just like plastics. So they are definitely in scope. And then the question is, how should they be treated thereafter? And I think what's important to think about is to think about compostability in the same way as you think about recycling, is that, you know, it's one thing to say PET can be recycled, as you could say, this paper cup could be composted. So the question is, will it be composted and will it be recycled? So how do we move from could be recycled, could be composted, to will be recycled, will be composted? And a lot of the steps in the process are the same. So the first thing is that it has to be identifiable, it has to be collected separately, and it has to have a way. So first challenge is, can you collect it? Is someone going to collect it and separate it? Then the question is, where's it going to go? So again, we could collect all the PET separately, but if we didn't have a PET recycling industry, then it wouldn't matter that PET is recyclable. So the next step for composting is that you have to look at composting as a recycling industry that requires capability and capacity. It needs collection to feed it, but then it needs resource and equipment to run. And it needs to be national if you want to assume that everything can be composted nationally. So you have to be comfortable that something can be collected, then it can be composted. One of the challenges with composting is that in many countries, they ride on the back of organic waste collection from gardens and things like that. So you have a organic composting, say, waste stream that already exists, and then you potentially add your compostable cup or saucer or whatever to that waste stream. So in other words, the waste stream is there, and you put leaves and old lettuce and a compostable cup into the same target. Now, we don't have that as South Africa. I think in some municipalities they may have it, but for the most we don't. And one of the challenges is that material provides a lot of critical mass to composting. And the question is, can you sustain a compostable packaging only recycling operation, or do you have to have compostable leaves and lettuce and old food in order to actually make composting work? So it's very important to think about it, is that, you know, just about having something that's compostable is only half the problem. You have to have the collection and recycling operation thereafter. Reuse is much easier because, you know, it can go into farming. You know, obviously from PET's perspective, we have to then find reuse. But so reuse is easier, but the collection and capacity are basically the same challenge.
I think, David, what I would add to that as well is that you have industrial composting standards and then home composting. Yeah. So the design of products in this whole story, of course, is where it all starts. And the back to the communication to both the industry, the collectors, and the reprocessors who would deal with that product to understand whether it goes in this stream or that stream.
Absolutely.
So just a follow-up question, it just says, have they set up their PRO, the compostable, biodegradable people? Do you know?
I'm not sure if the Compost Association, Cara, you may know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it.
Or whether it's an association under which a PRO could be formed. I'm not sure, but if anyone's really interested, we can give you the name of the person to contact who's one of the experts in the field of compostability.
Yeah, as far as I know, I'm not sure if the PRO has actually been set up yet. As far as I know, I think it's an association at this point.
And remember, the test will be, are people paying levies on compostable material? And yeah. until you're doing that, because as I said, the two are very similar. It's going to require input, it's going to require money, and that money has to come from the users and producers under EPR of the compostable material. So if you're using compostable, you should be paying a PRO, as opposed to, yes, there is an organization which promotes the use of compostable packaging. That's not a PRO.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, one's got to walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
And just a comment on the discussion that we've just had, it says, this is my bugbear, RE compostable packaging. Look at it carefully. Almost all of it can only be handled with industrial composting setup. Never mind the fact that PLA, etc., gets imported to RSA. So,
yeah. And remember that even in industrial, I mean, all those who watched that Dutch video, is that industrial composting likes to run on like a 4 or 5 week cycle. And a lot of these qualifications, they take 10, 12, 16 weeks to compost, which means that they can compost, but practically they won't work in the system that is being set up. So again, your system has to be set up for the waste that you're creating. And that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. So another question, and also just to say, we wanted to make this session fairly informal, this Q&A discussion. So if you have something that you would like to say, please feel free to raise your hand, and I would be happy to allow you to talk as well and make a comment if you would prefer not to put it into the Q&A section. So another question, how should we effectively track packaging imported on products, and how should this be reported? That's part 1 and 2 of a 3-part question.
So I think there's 2 parts to it. Okay, the first one is that by we, I think you must mean the producer. Okay, so the first challenge is that the obligation must be for the producer to report the packaging, because the producer is closest to it. So if I'm importing a product, so we import very little, but we do import some things, some Monster cans, for example. So let's say I import Monster cans. I would have to then include those Monster cans in the aluminium that I use in my aluminium declaration. So it's not up to the aluminium PRO to track the import of Monster cans. It's up to me as Coca-Cola to know what I imported and to declare it along with my local consumption. Okay, so that's the first important thing to remember. So that once you understand that the producer is going to get that information, the producer is much closer to the information, the use. Now, in let's call it traditional FMCG, that is much easier. Okay, so whether you're importing Monster cans or biscuits or tea or washing powder, it's quite easy if you think about the Lorex model to say each bottle of let's take Nivea hand cream. Each a bottle of Nivea hand cream has a bottle and a cap and a label, and therefore it works out in a tonnage, and I can work out if I'm based off South Africa how much of the packaging I'm importing. That's relatively easy, and the link is between the producer and then declaring it to the PRO. The more difficult one, and this is where I see the greatest challenge for us, is what happens if you're macro? Okay, now if you macro, you're importing a fridge, but now what you have to remember is that you're importing the fridge, and when you import the fridge, it comes in a container, and then inside the container is a wooden frame, and the wooden frame has got an LDP shroud over it. That's got some shrink, and it's got some strapping, and then it's got some cardboard around the fridge. So when I sell a fridge on my floor, I may sell a fridge, and I might put it in the back of a bucket. It may or may not have packaging. But what I'm understanding is now is this disconnect between I don't sell packaging. I don't sell cans of Coke or whatever else. I sell a fridge, and I import the fridge. But now you have to make the link between being macro and the packaging that you imported with the fridge. And again, the link is not to the PRO. So it mustn't be the PRO's responsibility to now try and estimate how many fridges macro imported and how much cardboard was attached to each fridge. It's up to macro to break down every item that they're importing and to say, with each fridge comes 2 kilos of cardboard and 500 grams of LDPE shrink sleeve. So again, that's the more tenuous link, and that's the more difficult one. But it's important to understand it's not, the PROs can't do it. The government can't do it. It's up to the producer, whether they're an importer or whether they're a local producer, to do all of that stuff and to declare that to the PRO. Sherry, you want to add to that? I mean, it's a great question, because imported packaging is going to be a real challenge.
No, I think you've covered it really well, David. I think it's important, and I think it's for us in South Africa, it hasn't been included in any of our figures to date. So it will be part of that restating what our figures include, and of course it will mean a bigger market size for every single material.
Yeah, and for some materials it's significant, and for some it isn't. I mean, if you guys just think about how many things come into this country in cardboard boxes, you can imagine that you can't ignore the quantity of corrugated cardboard that is coming in on every white good or FMCG item that you purchase. It has to be counted because it ends up in the market.
Okay, so then part 3 of that question is, do you think that we effectively track packaging imported as packaging for packaging and sale of goods in SA, i.e. insufficient detail, RE packaging materials and recycled content?
Not yet.
Okay.
No, not at all.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yet.
Yet.
Look, I mean,
We will get there.
To be fair, there are categories and there are PROs that look at it. So I know I am on the glass recycling company, and the glass industry does try to estimate both what is exported and what is imported. You know, for PET, there's almost it's a rounding error in terms of imports of PET. You just don't import product in PET. But in glass, if you think about all the whiskey and spirits that comes in, you actually have to try and account for it. And at the moment, that's being done, let's call it by the PRO at a distance. But it really needs to be done, you know, so if the distiller importing whiskey from Scotland, they should be declaring exactly to the ton. It shouldn't be a case of, well, let's estimate it based on an assumption of 850 grams for every whiskey bottle, and we think this is the local versus, it should be simple. You know, if you're an importer, you declare it. And that's the step chain that we've got to make. But it's very far from where we are today.
I think, David, that the paper people, and Jane Maloney can confirm this if anyone has a particular interest in the paper sector. I think that they have been looking at certain imports of their product, and they probably then, along with some aspects of glass, would be the only organization that has some insight.
Yeah, I don't know much about that, but I can certainly confirm glass do try and do it.
2 follow-up comments on the discussion that we've just been having. It says, well, it's a question / a comment. It says, is there no way for the PROs to collaborate? Fridge handled by the WEE PRO, as this is related to their core business. And then when received by WEE recycler, any cardboard to be passed on to paper recycler, we need to sign up MOUs to collaborate that way.
Well, there will be collaboration between PROs, but the point is that producers will be obliged to declare what they put onto the market. So we'll have to be very careful of double counting if we are getting data from multiple sources. So I think in terms of David's measurement flow and understanding at which points we're going to measure and where products are going to be declared, it's going to be really key that all PROs operate according to the same set of rules or regulations or guidelines, whatever we end up calling them.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and I'm not really sure whether the question refers to a measurement or whether it refers to actually collaboration in terms of how you recover stuff. So I think there can be collaboration on both spheres, and that's why we talk about this idea of a sort of central clearinghouse. You know, is there someone who can pull information together to make sure that it's reasonable? And as you say, well, if someone's declaring 10,000 fridges, the question is, did they declare the cardboard and LDPE that came in with those 10,000 fridges? Because if they just declare fridges and they say, no, I didn't bring any cardboard, then you'd be able to say, well, clearly something's wrong. So that would be an example of where on a measurement and sort of system, you can see collaboration. But also, the reality is that in waste recovery, there's very little dedicated stream-specific collection. So you very seldom see someone who only collects glass or only collects aluminium or only collects HDPE. And I think that's where we need to recognize that the waste management system is less substrate specific than the PRO environment currently. And that's going to be the sort of biggest challenge, is that we're trying to be sort of siloed in an environment where the waste isn't siloed. Yes, we can separate it, but where it starts in the collection space, it's all mixed together. And that's where there can also be a lot of cooperation.
Thank you. Another question, what feedback has DEF given on the comments on regulations? This person missed the first few minutes of today. When will they be finalized?
Yes,
Sherry?
today, but can you hear?
No, we lost you for the beginning.
We
so I
lost
think
you.
say it again. Yeah.
Sorry about that. We are still waiting to get feedback from the department. We understand that it's imminent, but we don't have an indication of which day. It could be today, it could be next week.
Thank you. Someone has said, and I suppose this is aimed at you, David, are all the PROs aligned with your views?
So I think the challenge here is not really to present a PETCO view. The challenge is really to try and present what we see, as a sort of global best practice. And I think that ultimately it's less about this is a view of what we've picked up in terms of global best practice. And as you guys have obviously seen, we've had a lot of input from experts outside of PETCO. So what we've really tried to do is put forward a view that we see being let's say put forward outside and being particularly, as Sherry said, being used in Europe, because Europe is really sort of leading the way in terms of EPR. And that's why they are really confronting this sort of measurement best practice rules. So there are parts of this that are going to challenge the PETCO methodology. So it's not, let's be clear, this is not exactly a PETCO thing. I think the challenge is yes, there would have to be sort of some alignment. And I think that there is alignment on some things, and where there are differences, a lot of those things have already been acknowledged. So for example, where imports and exports are not being included, I think people acknowledge that, well, we haven't included it, but we haven't had a way of measuring it, so we've excluded it. So it's not that they're saying, well, it shouldn't be counted, because it's not an argument about the principle, it's a matter about the practicality of, but how do we measure imports? We can't measure imports currently. And the reality is it's very difficult if you don't have those declarations coming from all your members. So I think that's where there's less of a challenge. The most important thing though is that ultimately, whatever these rules are, and there is some room for sort of negotiation and alignment, but we must have alignment. And we must have alignment between ourselves as PROs and of government. Because the most important thing is that when we talk about targets, is that you can't talk about targets if you don't have the same methodology. So you can't have a situation where one person's including pre-consumer material and one person's excluding it, because the numbers are going to be incomparable. You can't have a situation where one person is excluding returnables and another person's including it. They're going to be incomparable. So again, we need to agree the rules, and most importantly, we need to agree them with DEF. And that's why one of the things we've said is, in setting up these rules, they need to be in the framework, or perhaps even in the regulations, as a guide of these are the ways of measuring that we expect you to report on. And you can see, as Sherry mentioned in the beginning, this is something that Europe is going through. Then it's not a matter of all PROs, then it's a matter of all countries. So Estonia wants to do it one way and Wales wants to do it another way. Germany think that their methodology is best. And you have a situation where Sweden says our number is at 90 and Estonia says, well, our number is 95, and the Swedes will tell you, no, but we don't believe your number. So, it's a universal problem, and it comes back to defining rules. And I think that we should really borrow with pride in some cases and take as much as we can particularly from the EU, who have been through these exact same issues, and start to say, okay, this is what we see as best practice. Let's start with this, align, and if any issues come up, then let's evolve it over time. Because that's the other really important thing that we've tried to sort of highlight to DEF, is that what we see in EPR regulations is it's a journey. It's not a overnight success. And what you will see is you will set up rules and you'll set up regulations, and they will evolve, and the landscape will change, and then you will pick up weaknesses, and then you can revise your regulations and change it. And people say, well, it's not, these rules aren't exactly clear, right? New issue or some kind of guideline or something that says, okay, we've picked up an area of let's say dispute. We've had a workshop and a discussion. These are the rules that we want you to apply going forward. Yes, you can restate your numbers going back or whatever it is, but it's most important to get alignment. So not necessarily to agree with what we've discussed today, but most importantly to have alignment.
Thank you. Some more questions coming through. It says, hi, Cherie and David. While we are at budget phase presently, my challenge is what do I budget in terms of the levies to be paid on different waste streams?
Yeah, good question. So I'll tell you what I've done is I've given the business a high and a low number. And essentially what I've said is that the number will be based potentially on what you see in the market today. But remember that the challenge, and Sherry's smiling because she can't give you an answer today. And the reason she can't give you an answer is because she doesn't know what Petco is going to have to do in terms of the Section 18 regulations. So what is finally included in the scope of the regulations could drastically affect what a PRO is expected to do, and therefore how much they're going to charge you. So my view is that in many cases, the EPR fees that we are seeing today are way lower than we could end up with. And from that perspective, I would be conservative about saying, particularly with some of the materials that are particularly cheap today, budget for a significant increase on what you see. So find out what the number is today, and then say worst case could be double. From Petco perspective, I think, Sherry, we can say it won't be double, but it'll sort of go up in a region of inflation to potentially a bit more, depending on what we get told to do from the Section 18 regulations.
I think, David, that's really a good way to answer that. I think, of course, the other issue to take into consideration is that unlike Europe, who are moving to an eco-modulated fee, so they've always had differentiated fees based on certain measurements that kind of made the system fair for different materials. But they are moving to eco-modulation because what the authorities have found around the world is that the one area that EPR didn't work, it actually failed, was in really encouraging producers to change poorly designed products, packaging, and put it on the market. So what they are doing now, and this is included in the South African legislation, our government wants us to look at eco-modulated fees. So if you happen to be using packaging that is particularly challenging to collect and recycle, has particularly low value, then take that into account in your budgeting as well, because you will be required in your fee to actually fill that gap. I think David's got a lovely way of describing that as the gap in the value chain, the economic value chain. So just consider that as well.
Yeah, and I think those things will evolve, but Sherry's right. I mean, one thing we've been challenged as a Petco team by a number of these international experts is to say, if you're not differentiating, then you're not doing enough. You need to do more to differentiate. So that may mean, at the moment we've got one price for PET, but perhaps we should have a price for clear PET and a price for colored PET. That's one of the basic changes that we see in many countries, is to say, if you want to incentivize more people to move to clear, then you should have a differentiation. But that's less of a budgeting issue, because I think, we're talking about a total amount of money, unless you use, bright blue bottles. But the key is that I think you've got to assume, whether it's paper, whether it's metal, whether it's glass, there could be a significant increase in the amount of money that's required under these EPR regulations.
Okay, another question. It says, producers not manufacturing the label, but printing on it. Does Section 18 include them? And I think this goes back to the definition of what is a producer.
So yes, the way that industry has come together, and the way that's been proposed to DEF is that the producer will be the person at the end of the chain that makes the decision, the person that is effectively the owner of the brand that uses that label. Whether you make the label or whether you print on the label is another matter. But remember, what it means is that you are the producer. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will you will have to contribute directly to the EPR. So you could have a situation where you are the producer, but the industry or the representation for that material agree that the converter will charge you the EPR fee in the material. So for example, perhaps your label with no printing on it, that it will arrive with the EPR fee already built in. Now that's to be decided, to be clear. So in PET, for example, the one space where we see this as being potentially the only solution is in the space of thermoforms, where you know, a lot of them get delivered to multiple independent shop owners, and it would be very difficult to collect all the money on the thermoforms for every sandwich sold at every Spar or every Pick and Pay family store. So there may need to be another mechanism of collecting it, and that item may arrive at the Spar already with the EPR fee built in. It doesn't mean that the Spar owner is not the producer. It just means that they have found a way to comply that doesn't require them to interact on a payment basis directly with the PRO. It gets done in a separate way. So separate, are you the producer? Yes. Are you going to be the one paying, you know, every month to the PRO? Perhaps not, but that will have to be decided by the PRO that represents that label.
It's an interesting one, David, because there are two elements for me. One is about the collection point in the value chain of fees. The other one is about the influence that the producer has on the materials they select. So for example, since we're talking thermoform, the labels are really important in the recycling process, because if they're not the correct labels used and they're not the correct glues used, of course, they make recycling more difficult. So the yields are lower, the wastage is higher, and the fee needs to be higher. So it'll be interesting to work out the cross-section between the design responsibility and where simply in the value chain the funding is actually collected.
Yeah, that's interesting, because where the color is in the PET, it's easy to allocate the eco-modulated fee. Where the item making the item recyclable is a separate item that's added to it. So whether a label or a shrink sleeve or something like that, then you have to look beyond PET, and you have to look at not PET, but PET bottles as a whole, with cap, with label, with date coding, and the same with thermoforms. So yeah, maybe thermoform stickers will be in the PET PRO.
Thank you. Another question, it says, is there any summary documentation being presented to producers for them to understand the eventual legislation? And are all the producers currently buying into this and participating?
So I know we've shared as under Consumer Goods Council. The Consumer Goods Council is really been trying to pull together producers, brand owners, retailers, because they are effectively the sort of collective organization for producers. So they've really tried. They've had a number of webinars, circulated a number of documents trying to outline Section 18. I think the truth is that not everyone has been reached, and some people perhaps don't agree. And I suspect some people will just say, well, we'll wait till we see the final regulations. We don't think it's going to happen, or whatever. So I suspect that when the regulations are finally gazetted, there'll be another round of communication and alignment. And I think at that point, it won't be a matter of speculation or sort of, this is what we think it's going to be. It's going to be, well, this is what it is, guys. So I think, the Consumer Goods Council from that perspective is really the communication, and I'm sure that after the regulations are published, we'll go through a second round of sharing information. So if anyone does know of anyone who doesn't have it or whatever, my suggestion is that they really go look at, contact the Consumer Goods Council. As Petco, I'm sure we will do the same and sort of give an update on what is exactly in the regulations once we have them as well. And perhaps try and find a way of sharing something that people can keep as a reference. Sherry, I'm sure you would agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. The Regulations Gazette is a fairly short document, because the way that the department have handled it is they did a range of gazettes. So there's one that deals with the specific regulations that will apply to all priority streams or all waste streams. And then there are individual gazettes that deal either with paper and packaging or electronic waste or lighting. So from that perspective, I think the nice thing is that it's not a huge document. It's fairly tight and easy to understand. The second thing I wanted to mention was that the National Waste Management Strategy has also been updated, and the department will shortly release that as well. They did present it to Cabinet, and I understand that there were a few changes that Cabinet requested them to make. So that will probably be gazetted very closely to the regulations. It's a meatier document, but I think it's useful because it shares the intention of what government is thinking. And then the third process is that the WWF, together with the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and IUCN, the Nature Conservation Organization, they are putting together an EPR framework. So in all likelihood, we will have the regulations that will be gazetted, and then we will have an EPR framework, which will be a set of guidelines as such that will guide how EPR schemes could look. So our feedback to the department was essentially that give us clear and simple regulations if possible. So tell us what has to be done. And of course, the targets are probably the most important what that has to be achieved. But don't tell us how to do it. Give us a range of options that different materials with different characteristics can then decide how best to deliver on what they have to do. And I saw this morning that the consultation on that process will start on about the 3rd of November. And I think the last workshop that they are planning on having in their consultation process will be the 1st of December. So keep a lookout for those as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting question would be is if you did receive those documents or that webinar, that query this morning, is does this mean that the regulations might be delayed a little bit until after it? But we know that all the feedback that we've got so far says no, that they want to publish the regulations as soon as possible, which is a bit back to front. But yeah, we'll wait and see.
Alrighty, there's just one more comment and then I think we'll wrap up if there aren't any other questions. So I invite you to please submit anything if you have any last burning thoughts or comments. Just a comment that says, I steal this one from a previous Cape Town landfill site manager. Landfills don't get heavy, they get full. The point to make is that KPIs should not just be about weight, but should be volume-based to show the true picture of the impact, example, caused by expanded polystyrene. So that's just the last comment that I wanted to say.
It's a very valid comment, but remember that if you're comparing, you remember what I said about matching. If you are matching tons of polystyrene put into the market and tons of polystyrene collected, then you're measuring it the right way. If you're measuring tons of waste, then tons of polystyrene becomes irrelevant. And as you say, other light materials also become less focused on. And this is one of the reasons why we say you have to measure in like for like material on material, and not just try and put everything together in one bucket. And then, you know, as I said, what you see in US cities is they all focus on glass recycling because it's the densest material that they've got. But it doesn't solve their landfill problem because landfills, as you say, are volumetric.
Thank you. Okay, no more questions, no more comments. So that brings us to the end of our webinar series for now. As I said, I will be sending out a wrap-up of recordings of all the webinars, and please feel free to contact me if you feel like there's something that we haven't touched on well enough. We are happy to potentially look at hosting another webinar to address any queries that you feel have not been dealt with deeply enough. So just a big thank you firstly to David, who's partaken in 3 of the webinars of our webinar series. Your knowledge and expertise and generosity with it is really, really appreciated, and thank you for all the time that you've put into them. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you to Cherie for your time and effort, and to everyone for attending. To the people who have repeat attended, thank you. Or if it's your first one, we hope that you will be able to watch the recordings. So with that, goodbye and have a great Wednesday, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch in the future.